Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of the Tell Me It Will Be Okay podcast. This used to be the Child Anxiety Fact podcast, but this year, 2026, we're going to shift to Tell Me It Will Be Okay. And I wanted to explain to you a little bit why I decided to change things up. And the biggest reason is I think I've done more than 130 episodes of the Child Anxiety Fact podcast. I think that number is a little higher because I think I lost some episodes when I transferred over from one podcast hosting software to another. And that's 130 questions that you all have asked that I have answered. And I feel like I've answered most of the general questions. And I wanted to dig into some more specific things about supporting our anxious kids and living in an anxious world. And the best way to do that was to change from the frequently asked questions format to a more general format. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to ever answer any questions. You are welcome. And in fact, I encourage you to continue to submit your questions. They will inform what I share. And I will also continue to pull from questions I get asked after I do my speaking engagements. So I give a talk called Tell Me It Will Be Okay. And at the end of the talk, I take questions. And sometimes those questions are so good that I have brought them to the podcast in the past, and I'll continue to do that. And also, this will allow me to bring in some other experts to talk about other aspects of child and teen anxiety. So I'm excited about this change. It's going to be fun for me to be a little more flexible and to bring up topics that just seem to be in the air. I notice, and this has been true since I first started doing therapy with clients, that themes show up in my office. So in my clinical work, I'll see things coming up for many of my clients all at once. Like there's something in the air in the zeitgeist that everybody is struggling with a particular thing. Now I can bring some of those things to my podcast because maybe those things are coming up for you too. Today, I wanted to talk about catastrophizing, which is a cognitive distortion. Cognitive distortions are thinking errors that are common for those of us with anxiety. Now, everybody has thinking errors sometimes, whether or not you have anxiety, because it's just kind of the way that we function as humans. Cognitive behavioral therapy looks specifically at these thinking errors, at these negative cognitions, and talks about ways to challenge and cope with them. Now, I wanted to go off track here a little bit and talk a little bit about cognitive behavioral therapy because a lot of people hate it. And I'll tell you that originally, when I first started becoming a therapist, I was a little bored of it too, because as a therapist and as a human, I tend to be more existential in my thinking, which is meaning of life stuff, how to deal with the meaning of life, the being a human stuff. And cognitive behavioral therapy seemed too simplistic to me. Like I could just feel myself resist it. But as I actually got into the work of doing therapy, which you do in your last year of school, you get a practicum and then an internship where you are being closely supervised as you start working with clients, I realized that cognitive behavioral therapy underlies so much of the work that we do. And the mistake is when we think it's the whole thing instead of part of the thing. And CBT can be really helpful if we use it to interrogate that existential crisis. That is to say, nothing fixes everything because we are living in a world that is imperfect and complicated, and much of it is outside of our control. So one of the complaints about CBT is it doesn't acknowledge the systemic issues that cause much of our pain. And that's true. You can't think your way out of poverty. You can't think your way out of climate crisis. You can't think your way out of the current political strife. No, that's not a matter of just putting on a shiny, happy visage and pretending like things are fine. And in fact, doing that is a sign of, I think, less good mental functioning. Pretending that everything is fine when it is not, that denial is not healthier, even if you end up kind of being happier, because happiness is not necessarily the point. Isn't this so complicated? But that's part of what I wanted to start bringing to these episodes is this great big messy complication that is anxiety work. So back to CBT, it's a tool. Like all things, it's a tool. And learning how to use those tools gives you more options as you figure out how to deal with your own anxiety, how to support your child in dealing with their own anxiety. And one of the things that I think is really helpful is looking at these negative cognitions. Now, the thinking of CBT, there's sort of a CBT triangle, which is our thoughts influence our feelings and behaviors. Like this is this great big messy cycle. So if I see a dog and I'm afraid of dogs, I have the feeling of fear when I see the dog and I think to myself that dog is dangerous, and then I act as if that dog is dangerous, and the dog might not be dangerous. But if I feel the danger and I start thinking about danger, I will act as if danger. So you can get into one of these points of the triangle to intervene. And where you intervene really depends on the person and the situation and what's going on. You can intervene in the feeling, like taking care of your feeling, taking deep breaths to calm your body down, and you can interfere in the thinking, which is what we're talking about now, that negative cognition. The negative cognition I want to talk about today is catastrophizing because it's super common. Catastrophizing is basically assuming that something will be catastrophic and acting as if the thing will be catastrophic. And you may indeed feel that things are catastrophic. And sometimes, in fact, they are. So how do we live with that? One of the challenges of CBT is, again, it really depends on who you are and where you are and what your goals are. I was thinking about this. I was walking last night in the dark, wearing a little headlamp because where I live, it's a dark skies community, and so it gets really dark. And it's a really good time for me to be thinking. And I was thinking about catastrophizing, in part because yesterday was a difficult news day. I am recording this on January 8th. January 7th, ICE killed a woman in Minnesota. A lot of my clients are scared. I am scared. My children are scared. My husband is scared. Lots is going on in the international news, and it's easy to catastrophize because this is kind of a catastrophe. So what do we do with that? How do we deal with that? So I was thinking about preppers. There are some people who right now are prepping. I was just talking to someone over the holidays, and I can't even remember who it is now, but they were describing the lengths that they have gone to prep and the amount of food that they have socked away and the fuel they have socked away and their plans for the end of the world, basically. And I was thinking about that and thinking about, that is a choice. That is a choice. I don't really have a lot of judgment about that choice. It's not my choice. It's not how I'm functioning in the midst of this, but it is how they're functioning. And they're catastrophizing and planning for catastrophe. Is that a bad decision? Depends on who you ask. For a lot of people, that's a good decision. There are people who are trying to figure out how to move out of the country. Is that catastrophizing? Yeah, it is. Is it a bad decision? I don't know. I have no idea. It comes down to values and situation and what you have access to. A lot of us are just trying to cope day to day. So we can't think about catastrophizing because that sends us down a rabbit hole of greater fear and anxiety. Other people thinking in terms of catastrophe is actually a way for them to try to manage their anxiety. Catastrophizing means assuming that worst case scenario and then acting as if. Now, do you see, if you and I were on a subreddit that was about prepping, this would be a realistic form of functioning. On the other hand, if we're on a subreddit that's about optimism and feeling positive about the future, the prepping would look like a sign of not functioning. If I quit my job, quit working with clients, and decided to go all in on digging a bunker, that might not be a very safe, functional choice for me because then I wouldn't have an income. And if I didn't have an income, how am I going to buy all the food for my prepping station? Do you see what I'm saying? So it's about values and it's about functioning. So you can't just look at one person's idea and say that is a bad idea, which is another challenging thing about anxiety work. If I'm working with clients and one is a prepper, I need to see that in the context of their life and values and choices and not just assume They should not be doing that. That is dysfunctional anxiety. And at the same time, if I have another client who is not thinking that way and who is not in denial, but just not letting the current news cycle impact their functioning, who's to say that that's more or less healthy? You are going to have to make some decisions about this. When it comes to catastrophizing, you have to make some decisions about this. So how do you do that? Well, part of it, again, is values. Is the thinking that is driving your decision making, does it resonate with your values? Is it allowing you to go towards the things you want out of life? Sometimes this is not easy to figure out. If you are operating with catastrophizing, then nothing you do is too much. You would do everything to avoid this particular situation or to create a particular situation. Let's back up again. In our world, there's a lot of catastrophizing about health, which is people who are assuming that if you don't eat a certain way or avoid certain foods, that you will have catastrophic health. The thing about this is, of course, we don't know because it's really complicated. Every human being has a different biological experience. We all have different genetic destinies that we may or may not know about. And we're all growing up in environments that impact our health differently. So one person can follow one diet, one specific kind of diet, and they may avoid some health issues. And another person could be on the same kind of eating regime, and they will have the health issues that that eating regime is supposed to avoid. So let's say every morning drinking a green smoothie and you're drinking it because you want to keep your heart healthy, that's not necessarily going to keep you from having a heart attack because heart disease is much more complicated than just drink a green smoothie every morning. There's a lot of messaging around food and vitamins and supplements that roots itself into catastrophic thinking. And then people are making these decisions based on the idea that they have control. But we do not have control. We have some control. We don't have complete control. So the issue is not should you or should you not drink a green smoothie. Is catastrophic thinking inspiring you to healthier, I'm using air quotes for those of you who are listening and not watching, healthier choices? It's more about, are you living your life as if you can control outcomes more than you can? And what are you missing out on by trying to control things? If you believe, if I eat like this, I will never get cancer, and you are limiting what you eat so much that it is consuming your life, that it is the main thing you think about when you wake up in the morning, that restriction drives every decision, that you are unable to loosen up on vacation or holidays or spending time with friends, then that is some catastrophic anxious thinking. Believing that you, through your actions alone, can decide the course of everything is anxious, catastrophic thinking, because we can't. Cognitive distortions are teaching us that we have more control than we do. That life, if lived a particular way, will eliminate uncertainty and risk. That's just not possible. Instead, we need to live with the reality that things are often outside of our control. That we do not actually get to decide whether or not we get heart disease, whether or not we get cancer, and importantly, whether or not we can control those outcomes for our children. When I'm talking to parents about anxiety, I see this catastrophic thinking often. When we're talking about their anxious child, they are often bringing catastrophic thinking to their conceptualization of what's happening for their child. So they might say things like, if my child does not learn how to manage their anxiety, I am afraid they will never be able to move out of the house. They will never be able to get a job. They will never be able to find a partner. That is catastrophic thinking. We don't know what will happen for our children. We may raise them perfectly well with all of the bells and whistles, everything that people say makes for a good parent, and we can still have a child who struggles. At the same time, there are lots of people who kind of phone it in as parents, and they still end up with great kids. We do not have as much control over the outcome for our children as we think we do. What we can do is create opportunity. We can grow ourselves as humans, and we can give our children access to choices, access to tools, access to resources and relationships. And then our kids get to decide. So when parents say, I'm afraid that if we don't deal with this anxiety, this will all happen, I go, I don't know. But I do know that dealing with the anxiety is a good thing because it's giving your child options. And doing this work will help you grow as a human too. So let's just deal with the anxiety. The other thing that comes up when we're talking about how we're going to help our child face their fears is, again, catastrophic thinking. So, for example, I'll say, hey, you really want your child to sleep alone at night. And so you are going to tell your child, I am not going to lay down with you until I do all this other work, and then I will come lay down with you for 5 minutes, or I will lay down with you for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'm going to get up and do my work, whatever. However, we've constructed that you are going to limit your time laying down with your child to help them sleep. Maybe that's the intervention we're doing, the separation anxiety that is common at bedtime for lots of kids, not just little ones, but big ones. And then the parent says, but then my child won't get any sleep, but then they'll keep the whole house up. But what if my child gets really angry with me? What if my child feels traumatized by the separation? What if my child leaves the house in a fury and runs away after 2 a.m. and we can't find them? And catastrophic thinking. When we're talking about those interventions, the parent often brings catastrophic thinking to why they can't do the intervention. Recognizing catastrophic thinking helps us understand this is my anxiety talking. It's not that we go like this, oh, that would never happen. It might happen. Your child might be extremely upset. Your family might not get any sleep. Your child might say, you are traumatizing me by not laying down with me. Your child may throw a fit and trash the room. Yeah, that might happen. It's not necessarily likely. I mean, we make plans to deal with that, but it can happen. In my training with Dr. Ellie Lebowitz, who is the man who designed the SPACE protocol, Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions, which is a specific structured protocol to deal with child anxiety through working with the parents. So that is some of my training in child anxiety. But he gave an example of a child, and I cannot remember the circumstances, but when the family pulled back on the accommodations for that child, and I can't remember what it was, I do know the child was in a car alone, like in the back seat of the car alone, and the parents had got out of the car was in the driveway, I don't know. The child ended up poking holes in the leather seats throughout the car. And that was a catastrophe. It wasn't actually a catastrophe the family had planned for. They were surprised for it, but the catastrophe did happen. And you know what? It happened. The family dealt with it, but they continued to do the anxiety work because the anxiety work has to be done. So generally, when we're doing this anxiety work with kids and when we're creating an exposure, we do plan for catastrophes and we plan for how we're going to deal with them. So that is one way you can handle catastrophic thinking, is you say, wow, that is a worst case scenario. Is it likely to happen? It's not that likely, but let's plan for it just in case, because that is one way we can take care of that catastrophic concern. That's one way you deal with it. So if your child says, I am so nervous about the book report and I'm afraid that I am going to wet my pants in front of the class because I'm so nervous, then we would say, well, make sure you go to the bathroom beforehand. That would be part of the planning for the exposure. Make sure you get time to go to the bathroom beforehand, makes it less likely for you to wet your pants. Or maybe don't drink as much at lunchtime and use the bathroom beforehand so you're less likely to wet your pants. That's what we do. We don't say, oh my gosh, you're right, that could happen. That could happen. You better not do it because that's too much risk. That's the danger of catastrophic thinking, is you make the decision based on the catastrophe instead of saying, okay, well, how will we deal with the catastrophe? Now, with many of us, we just often pile the catastrophe upon catastrophe as a stalling tactic. Not in a manipulative way, but in a way that our brain is like, do not go towards that. Do not speak in front of the class. We've solved the wet your pants problem, but what if you throw up in front of everybody problem? That's still a problem. So then you plan for that. And then they go, wait, but what if you lose your voice? What if that happens? What if you forget what you're going to say? What if you can't read your handwriting? What if everybody points and laughs? It continues to pile on. And we label that is catastrophic thinking. I am catastrophizing. I am catastrophizing because I feel afraid. We cannot answer every potential catastrophe because some of them we won't even think of, like the kid in the back seat putting holes in the leather. So, the cognitive distortions of catastrophizing we need to recognize as catastrophizing. How often do we go to worst case scenario? How often are we spending time trying to avoid a worst case scenario? How often is worrying about a worst case scenario sending us into choices that limit us or do not align with our values? So the prepper who is super excited about having big gallon containers of rice, that's fine. If it's making them happy, they're not going broke doing it, like they're still able to pay their mortgage, they're still able to put gas in their car, whatever, they're still able to function, then we can align that as, okay, that's a values-driven decision, even though it is based on catastrophic thinking. However, if somebody is doing that to the point that they're not functioning, they've quit their job, they're not paying their mortgage, they're saying, you know what, let the house go into foreclosure because who knows if we'll be here in 6 months, that's not such great functioning. Now, that catastrophe could happen. We might not be here in 6 months, but we might. And that is living life within catastrophe instead of kind of keeping one foot in each world. One foot in prepper world and one foot in everything might be fine world. Same thing with kids. If they say, I'm afraid that this is going to happen, yep, you're afraid that this is going to happen. So yeah, make sure that you go potty before you get up there and speak. But at the same time, do not be so living in that catastrophe that you don't go towards this thing you need to do to function. So that is catastrophic thinking. That is catastrophizing. That is about learning to cope, recognize cognitive distortions, how to face them. One other thing I wanted to say is that we often, when people are catastrophizing, just try to talk them out of it. That's not going to happen. You're being ridiculous. How likely is that? That's not helpful either. Very often when we say that's never going to happen, the person will double down because they're saying what you're not hearing is that I am afraid. So you don't have to fix it. Like you can plan, like go to the bathroom beforehand, but you also can just say, I totally appreciate that that is a worry you have about this. You still need to do the thing. I totally understand that you are afraid that if you go towards this thing that scares you, that bad things will happen. I totally get that. That is your anxiety talking. It's trying to protect you. However, we still need to try. When we are going towards something, we are just open to the possibility that it might be fine and that we can cope with whatever happens next. We can go very slowly so that we can acclimate to our fear as we go towards it. That is the art of the work of anxiety. When people reach out to me on social media or in the comments of these videos, people will say, but what do I do if I have a child who does X? And there's a lot of art to it. So the answer is always, you go towards the thing that scares you, but the how of it is much more complicated and nuanced and needs to take into account your family's values, your child's values, your bigger goals. Is this the place where you want to do the anxiety work, or is it someplace else? Like bedtime, often for families, they say, I'm just not ready to do it there yet, or I'm okay with laying down with my child. And I said, that is fine. We just need to be doing the work. We need to be exploring anxiety. We need to be noticing and labeling those cognitive distortions. We need to be dancing with them and dancing with our big emotional challenges to figure out how to work with our own already present skills and how to build new skills and strengthen skills because it's about coping. Anxious people are going to be anxious. Anxious kids are going to be anxious. We live in an anxious world, and yet we have to learn how to live in it. And that is really what anxiety work is all about. So this is the catastrophe episode. We will be talking about other cognitive distortions. We'll be talking about other means of coping in future episodes. If you have feedback for me, I would love to hear it. If you do have a question, I'd love to hear that too. If there's a topic you'd like me to dive into, let me know. You can go to my website at openbookparenting.com. There is an anonymous form to submit your questions or thoughts about the show. And there's also a regular old contact form if you would like to hear back from me, and lots of resources, including the Parenting Pitfalls quiz and courses that can help you in parenting your anxious child or teen. I look forward to hearing from you. And please make sure to subscribe to this podcast, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and of course, if you can, rate the podcast. That would be a big help. It lets other people who might need this show discover it. All right, I'll see you next episode.